Welcome to the Big World Made Small podcast for the adventure traveler. I'm thrilled you're here. My name is Jason Elkins, and in addition to being your host, I'm also a former U.S. Army paratrooper, third-generation commercial hot air balloon pilot, paramotor pilot, ex-Montana fly fishing guide, advanced open water scuba diver, and a full-time nomad that's visited more than 30 countries on 6 continents. As a seasoned adventure travel expert with a passion for creating and sharing meaningful experiences, I'm on a quest to impact the lives of adventure travelers, the tour operators they rely on, and the communities that host them. Every week, I bring you exclusive interviews with fascinating adventure tourism experts who have agreed to share their personal stories, favorite destinations, and some invaluable travel insights they've picked up along the way. We'll enjoy a casual conversation, create some connections, and likely share some laughs. It's my hope that by the end of each episode, this big world will feel just a bit smaller. Let's get started, shall we?
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Big World Made Small podcast for the adventure traveler. Today, I'm super excited. I've got a fellow, Colombia file, which is somebody who loves Colombia. I'm not sure if I made that word up, but I think I've heard it. And I've also got a fellow podcaster on the show, and some of you may know his name. He's got the Colombia Calling podcast. So we've got Richard McColl on. He is the Colombia Jack of all trades, is how that's his official title, I guess. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. As many of you know, I'm passionate about Colombia, and so is Richard. So Richard, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's always lovely to be on other podcasts.
Yes, absolutely. It's it's interesting because I've been doing the podcast for about a year and spent most of that time in Colombia. And your name has been on my radar. I was familiar with your show, and then I spoke with someone else. They said, you should talk to Richard. I'm like, oh, geez, I don't know what I was thinking. So I'm happy that we made that connection. So, Richard, where do you live?
Well, I live in Bogota, but we come and go between Bogota and Monpós, a small town inland in the Caribbean coast. But I live in Bogota full time. I like the big city. I like the anonymity of the capital, that I can just do what I need to do and get by.
Yeah, I get that completely. I'm just up the road here in Medellin. And Richard, we're going to talk a lot about Colombia. I know we are, but I really want to kind of understand you. What causes somebody to, because obviously you weren't born and raised in Colombia. What causes somebody to make that leap? And I think the best way to get there is to kind of hear your story. So I'm not sure how far back we need to go, but let's go back as far as you think necessary, and then I may ask some probing questions, go back even a little further. So where did it all start for you?
Well, let's say that the bug was planted in my third year of university in my undergrad. So we're looking back in 99, around then. So we're going back quite a ways.
Okay. And where was that? Where were you then?
I was studying at a university called Exeter in the southwest of England. I was studying humanities, languages, and so on. And I got a scholarship. In England, you study languages. In your third year, you get to go abroad, become, a full immersion and, try and get fluency. And I managed to get a scholarship to end up in Guatemala. And that was something really special. And actually, there's more to it than that. My father had lived for almost a decade in Brazil in the 60s. My stepmother had lived in Brazil, but not in the same place. She'd lived in Sao Paulo. My father had lived in Rio. My mother loved Mexico. And so as a child, I was brought up with this sort of knowledge of it, even though being born and raised in London, and then getting that third year abroad in Guatemala and working as an auxiliary teacher in a private school. I was, this part of the world really appeals to me. And I started studying the history and the literature. And after a while in journalism, I became sort of like an expert in Latin America for various outlets and so on. But being based in London meant that wasn't really the field of expertise that they wanted. If you're based in London, they want, Commonwealth, former empire stories. And after a while, jobbing here and there, I was like, I'm not in the right place. I can go this alone. And I left.
Very, very cool. Hey,
I haven't looked back.
Richard, we got to go back a little further because you said some things about your family that really intrigued me. And I'm trying to figure out, how does a family from England become so immersed in the Spanish culture? And I guess my first question was, like, your dad, why was he living in Latin America for, you said 10 years? How did that come about?
Yeah. Well, my dad's Canadian. He's passed on a long time ago now, but he was Canadian, and he was a geophysicist, geologist, and got a job working for I guess you'd say, the dictatorship in Brazil in exploration of oil fields and so on. So he was transferred with his young family. That's his first family was transferred down to Brazil. And he lived there for almost a decade. And in fact, so one of my half sisters was born in Brazil. So this was a long time ago. Then it was just well before I was, a consideration.
And then your mom was in New Mexico. You mentioned.
Yeah, she was from London, born and raised Londoner, and she had left and emigrated to Los Angeles as a young lady. Again, in the 60s, 70s, if I'm not mistaken, was a secretary at Universal Studios because they wanted British secretaries who were very well trained. There's a story there. It's her name. She's passed on, but her name's Leslie Nielsen. So just like the actor from The Naked Gun, but she was more famous in that period at Universal Studios than he was. So he had to get his mail off her. But that said, she hitchhiked Mexico in the 60s. With a friend and got into all sorts of scrapes. It left something. It left something there. It left something, a real love for the region. We would go back when I was young. We would go to Mexico a lot. So it sort of all comes in. And Mexico is, it's exotic, but can you imagine it back then? It was truly exotic.
Yeah, a young woman hitchhiking across Mexico. And so, which brings up the conversation, because there's something in the personalities of the people that do this type of thing, because most people don't. Realistically, you and I are here in Colombia. Your business is to engage with maybe expats that are coming in, and so you're really connected with that. But in reality, the vast majority of the world doesn't do these types of, most people stay where they were born, and generationally, and their friend network for most of their life is, people that they went to school with, that type of thing. And maybe this overgeneralization, but it brings up, like, what is it about personalities in some families that just have that gene? I don't know if it's the wanderlust or just that sense of, you know what, I'm going to go do it on my own. I don't need to stay where I'm at. If I see something more interesting, I'm going to move towards it. Have you given much thought to that? Is that something?
I consider things a lot. And my family, we restored a house in Portugal when I was young, or two. And my mother restored a place in France. And we did restorations of houses to sell on in London and so on. So the whole issue of actually sort of a permanent home, I think I moved house almost every year and a half up until I was 18. So there wasn't that great attachment, first and foremost, to like a physical set home. This is where I lived and grew up, and everyone, this isn't my childhood home. I could walk you through part of London and point out 8 different places I lived as a child. So I guess there's that. But also, you sort of think about it, especially if you're from, I don't know if it's changed, I've been away a long time, but in England, there's people always sort of shrug and question why you'd want to do something. It's not, well, at least in my mind, there wasn't a sort of attitude of doing something else. A lot of my friends, people who I would have grown up with, sort of banking and lawyers and so on, very stable, very easy. But I went to private school in which my closest friends were from all over the world or have moved over the world. So we were a kind of a bunch of people that were, I guess you're supposed to say, were transient. One of my great friends he was of Lebanese Canadian descent and grew up time in Saudi Arabia and then moved to Canada. Another great friend was half Italian, half Thai and grew up and is now back in Bangkok. Another friend was Greek and sort of grew up amongst restaurants. Mm-hmm. Somewhere, I think it was I can't remember where, but that sort of thing. And now another friend has moved over to Australia. So there's sort of an attitude amongst the people I was best friends with was always this bit more, would you say, adventurous or so on, which is great, And I think that helps a lot, is that you're not sort of cutting links. Of course, back in the day, it wasn't that common to do it. I think things have got a bit easier now. We can be sort of, let's say, location independent professionals. You can work remotely. But back in the day, it was a plunge, wasn't it? I mean, it was really something to do and different. I think, and I obviously I was born and raised in London. I I wanted something more. Don't get me wrong. The culture, I love the city. I love it very much, but I just wanted something different from what I was seeing as being the norm of the sort of routine commuting, paying for heating bills.
No, I'm with you completely. And I think it sounds like you had the benefit of being around other people that were kind of, well, let me ask you this. Do you think you were around people that were like you, or do you think that being around them influenced you to be kind of that way, or a combination?
I think there's a bit of both. I think I think we obviously sort of gravitated to one another, because I would still say that my closest long-term friends are those who have gone elsewhere and done other things, or even stayed in the UK but done more off the wall stuff, created their own businesses and so on. I think we are. There's a sort of network around us. I think also you have to come with somewhat of that attitude as well.
Right. Have you spent much time looking into like personality types, and is that something that's on your radar screen? Or maybe I would say maybe like ADD. I'm sure I've got ADHD, and I think that for me, the traveling and the novelty and the just putting myself in an area where I'm not sure I'm going to see something new, maybe not every day, but it seems like it. So I don't know, that comes up sometimes when I'm having conversations with folks, but
I don't know if I'm ADHD. I just think I don't think I've ever been tested for it, or anyone has said that I've ever had ADHD. What I really like is investigating and researching and finding it something new, something overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
These often end up being things that are of no economic viability.
Okay. I'm not going to say you have ADHD, but it sounds familiar.
And infuriating to my wife. What are you doing today? I'm investigating something that piqued my curiosity.
It's one thing kind of tied to that I'd come across somewhere, that it was like, we call it ADHD, but it's not necessarily, it's something that worked really well back in the hunter-gatherer day. If you were curious and open to exploring and were willing to leave the village, and you noticed things in the jungle that got your attention, you might be more likely to come back with meat for the village. And it was a great adaptation. But that same adaptation didn't work so well when we were farming fields, and and your job was to get up early in the morning and go out and do the same thing every day for 4 months until you get your harvest. So I like to just think of it as kind of a different adaptation. And I see that with people that I interview here on the show, and having worked in the adventure tourism space for a long time, it seems to attract that person that is curious. I think curiosity is the one you mentioned, kind of exploring things that maybe have no economic viability, but it's just that constant curiosity about things. And when you're curious, it's really hard to kind of sit still in the same house for 20, 30 years, going to the same job and driving the same car. And so anyway, I don't know where that came from.
So I might change my title as from jack of all trades to hunter-gatherer. I quite like that. It gives me a wild man thing. But it's like when you're over here, and you as well, it was explained to me, or seen by someone actually I met recently, who said, I understand these immigrants to other places have about 6 fishing rods cast at the same time and waits for the float to bob on whichever one. And that kind of works for my business strategy.
Yeah. I get it. If someone were to look at my life, I actually worked in the fishing business, so I get it completely.
Well, there you go.
And I think that was, I was a fly fishing guide and really into the fly fishing for a long time. And what was great about that for me, it was so stimulating for me, because fly fishing is very, you're moving, you're pursuing, you're constantly trying to figure things out. And it was always just, that was the exact stimulation I needed. And I get that from traveling. I'm also curious, because I think I've got a great opportunity to have a conversation with somebody that deals with, Colombia is a unique place. It has some stereotypes around it, both positive and maybe not so positive, if I were to use that word. And you're dealing a lot, or I believe you are, correct me if I'm wrong, you're dealing a lot with people from outside of Colombia that are interested in Colombia, coming to Colombia, visiting Colombia. Just the nature of your podcast is really to talk about Colombia. I'll let you discuss what that's all about. But I guess my question is, do you see differences in, so for example, the people that maybe are living in London that are interested in Colombia, or the people that are living in Canada, or the people that are living in other places around the world, do you notice a difference in the way they approach Colombia based on where they're from? And what does that say about kind of their personality or mindsets? I know this is a stereotype. I didn't think this question up ahead of time. So hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say.
Now, I know exactly what you're saying. It's like, for example, a week ago or so, I gave an hour and a half long lecture to 12 Americans over here. Something I do is give a sort of politics lecture and what's going on. And they were like, things have changed immensely. And I always say this, and I should, it was something a friend of mine said, who's also an analyst. And he said, and he's Colombian. He said, Colombia today is 15 years ago. It's better today than it was 15 years. And Colombia 15 years ago is better than it was 15 years prior to that. And I think that's why you are here, because there has been an improvement. But Colombia does have a justifiably dreadful reputation, just as it has a unjustifiably dreadful reputation. I mean, both can be balanced off. You and I sitting in absolute comfort, you are in Medellin or Envigado, and I'm in a very nice part of Bogota, and we travel around the country and so on. But talking about different nationalities or regions that treat Colombia differently. We opened up our hotel, the first one, in 2008 in Monpós, and immediately had French and German people coming through. Immediately. They've never had any fear of Colombia. Colombia is great, an adventure, something authentic. And they would come and have no issue with it. And then we had trickles of other nationalities, again, from the sort of, I would say, percentile of the population that's a bit more adventurous, who had been all over Latin. Colombia is not the first place you go to. People have been to Mexico, probably been to other places, Costa Rica, probably been to Peru. And Colombia sort of then falls into their lap because they've heard about it from other people on the road. If you really want to see something great, and you should go to Colombia. And that it's fascinating to me how that then becomes, it's like, wow, we'd never thought of going to Colombia. And then they look at it and then they get in and they're like, why didn't we think of this all those years ago? But for example, Europeans are not as concerned about coming to Colombia.
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
It's a curious thing. I don't really know. I would put a lot of it down to it just the culture of travel. We're so close to so many places that you can just get out and go. Most of Europe in the same time zone as Africa, for example. So it's just, it's a few hours. I can't even remember how many hours it is to get down to Egypt from London. It's not far, really, when you look at it, and all of these other things. And I think you're exposed to the travel because of the proximity. Whereas when you take the US, you could, spend a lifetime in the US visiting only the States and Canada. It's far. And I guess, and then when you look at it, it's like, okay, we're in the UK and we're looking to get away from winter. And we've got places, right, just keep heading south. And we have a culture of travel. If you look at a Canadian, let's get away from winter. Well, you're looking at an all-inclusive maybe in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, or Mexico. And it's travel, of course it is. But it's not really adventure because everything's put on a plate for you. And I think there's a different thing. And also the US, for example, and has Colombia's the sphere of influence. We don't need to get into the politics, but it's right there. It's the sphere of influence, and it's the very visual imagery of what has happened with Colombia. You get it far more, let's say, in the headlines than we would in the UK or France or somewhere else. So something bad happens in Colombia, it's reported first up in North America.
Right. And I remember
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you and I are probably fairly close in age. And I remember, when I was growing up, that was the news. Like we used to sit around and actually watch the news, with the family.
Yeah, I remember that.
Unfortunately, I don't do that anymore. I know that's a big part of your life, but I've just decided to ignore it, the news part. But anyway, that was what we saw on the news. It was Colombia was on the news. Seemed like every night. I don't know. It was just kind of what was going on. And so there's a lot of visual imagery there that definitely impacts Americans. But also I want to go back to this is my taking away. What you said makes a lot of sense. You've got proximity for Europeans I'm discussing. So if you live in London, it's pretty easy to go to all these other places. Also, England, I'm not going to say it's small, but it's not that big. And if you have if you have somewhere, You don't, like, if you are in the US and you live in Seattle and you have the urge to go somewhere, you can go to Florida and it feels, whatever, it feels a little different on some levels. But for the Europeans, I think part of it is there's a mix of different languages in Europe and Africa. And I think somebody from London or maybe France or Germany, for them to go on a trip into another country that speaks a different language is just normal. It's just not that big of a deal. And for Americans, I mean, I've had so many conversations with Americans about language, because they've never been out of the US, and say, oh, you should go to Mexico. So there's other things besides just language, but there's this fear of, I won't be able to talk to anybody. I won't be able to communicate. I'm already uncomfortable leaving my culture because I've spent so much time in the US. So it's just a much higher barrier psychologically, I think, for Americans to travel overseas to a place that they're not going to stay at a resort hotel where everything's taken care of for them. Whereas I feel like the French and the Germans and the Brits and the Danes, and it's just kind of normal to go get on a train for a few months and just travel around, whether it's in Europe and they're traveling to different cultures, where different languages, where they just have to figure things out, mostly from a young age, if not sooner, at least during that college age period. Does that sound right? Because I haven't lived in Europe. But that's what I see when I'm in Colombia or many of the places I've been. I see so many Europeans show up and they're so comfortable. They're just like, this is great. They don't ask questions they don't ask that, like, is it safe to go in this place? Is it safe to do that? They're like, oh, where can we get some cool food? Or where can we, they seem much more likely to go look for the adventure, where the American, if the average American shows up in the same type of places, they're much more concerned about the safety. They're much more likely to be talking about whether they should be using their cell phones in public, or how they should carry their money, or how they get home safely from the ATM. And the Europeans, I just never hear them asking. Is that your experience? Or
especially the language thing is, obviously the Brits are notoriously bad at learning languages. So I was in a minority, but of course that's changing now. But for example, when I was in that year in Guatemala, one of my colleagues at the private school was from Indiana. And he would ask me, well, what are you studying at university? Well, literature and languages, French and Spanish, and I've got a little bit of Portuguese in there and so on. And he's like, well, why? And I'm like, well, we're sitting here in Guatemala. Language is Spanish. And of course, although they're not, and there's more than 30 plus indigenous languages. Of course, we're not learning those. But I say, look at this. And he goes, well, yeah, but I could travel several thousand miles from Indiana in any direction and still speak English. But again, you're here in Guatemala. And he never made any effort at all. It was a bilingual school, and all the classes that he was teaching were in English. But I remember him, and this is a true story, I remember him, he would anglicize the surnames of all the Guatemalan children in his class. So Daniel Aguirre was Daniel Aguirre. And I don't think that's, I don't know what to say about this anymore. And it wasn't really worth me having a long conversation about it. It really wasn't worth it. So don't you want to communicate with other people? And you just don't see the need. I'm at the bilingual school. Everybody around me, my flatmates are all from North America. I'm only down here for a couple of years. But surely you're losing something. But he couldn't get it. And then I realized, on a Saturday, he was at TGI Fridays. He wasn't out trying, Guatemalan food. His social life was to go to the gym. And so he basically lived as if he was in a suburb of some like Indianapolis, as opposed to living in Guatemala. So I don't know. I don't know if it's a.
Do you know why he was there? Did that conversation come up?
I'm sure he was running away from something.
There is a stereotype there. That's a whole other conversation we could have about travelers.
But this is the deal. Yeah. For example, I went to Egypt and Morocco and so on, just when I was living in England, because again, it was so close and what have you. And I learned several phrases in Arabic to be able to say and order my breakfast. And the people, they love it. They look at you and I'm ordering scrambled eggs in Arabic. You got a smile, you were welcome back. And even though I couldn't extend the language, most of them, because they were in the service industry, could speak English, but they were far more accessible to me to discuss further things about the life and politics and so on. Come in, have a tea, let's chat. It's really nice, it makes a difference.
It's very, very cool. When in my past, I had a lot of opportunities to travel with work in the travel business, and I would lead groups and I would do all these things, but I really never pushed myself to actually learn the language. I mean, I'd learned some words, but I was only in a place for, 2-3 weeks at a time and not consistently going back to the same places. And when I started traveling full time a few years ago, when I came to Colombia, really when I got to Colombia a few years ago, I really had no Spanish other than a few basic words. And as I've learned over the last few years, I recognize, yes, just like you said, they respond to me completely different than when they would have, 6 or 7 years ago when I showed up some. And it's just a much deeper, richer connection. Even though my Spanish is not great, it's hard to have a really deep, profound conversation. But just the way that people approach you, they're more likely to try and speak English, for example. If I'm making an effort to speak Spanish and they know they speak English, they're more likely to work with me, and they appreciate, okay, if you're willing to put yourself out there, I'm willing to put myself out there. Where I'm sure 5-6 years ago, I'd meet the same person and they're like, you don't speak any Spanish. You're not even trying to speak Spanish. So yeah, I'm just going to give you a little bit to get us through this so I can move on with my life type of thing. But one of the, it's interesting that you mentioned Guatemala in your story, because at one point, probably a couple of years ago, my Spanish was getting better, and I had an opportunity to visit Guatemala with my son. And we went and visited a little hotel on Lake Atitlan. And the hotel owner was a Japanese guy, about my age. And he didn't speak any English, but we sat out one day. I'll never forget this. We sat out one day in the little courtyard at his motel and spoke in Spanish. And he told me his story. He's from Nagasaki in Japan. And, the United States and Japan have an interesting relationship that go back. My grandparents and his grandparents, were on two different sides of World War II. And he was about my age, growing up where he grew up. To me, it was, so we had this great conversation about how he came to Guatemala. He went and grabbed his photo album, showed me his photos. He told me all about his son, who was a little bit older than my son, who was visiting with me. And his son was in a military prep school there, and he was so proud. And we had this amazing conversation, all in Spanish, so to me, it was like, here I am in Guatemala having a conversation with a Japanese guy in Spanish. And it was an amazing connection that I would have had to go to Japan and found some guy that spoke English. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, man, I'm really, really happy that I'm learning Spanish. And it was just cool to connect with that man. So,
and it would never have happened. I mean, it would never have happened.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been limited to, here's my key, or, he gives me the key, shows me. It would have been I would have known nothing about the guy other than he was Asian and he was maybe managing this motel in Guatemala. That's all I would have got out of it, so it is worth it. And now that being said, because I don't want anybody that's listening to think I'm bad mouthing Americans. I'm certainly not. I mean, it's a great country. I'm very proud to be from the U.S. And anybody that's listening to this that's in the U.S. that feels like, I'm reluctant to go outside of the country because of whatever I've heard, or because I feel like I'm not going to be able to get along. You and I were just discussing the importance of learning a language, but don't let that stop you. I guess is what I'm saying. No. It's just because Jason and Richard say, you should learn the language where you're going, but don't let that stop you, because it's still better to go and have that, hopefully be inspired, to learn something.
I know. And that's the thing is over the years to see the increase and positive of citizens of North America coming to Colombia. Years back, you wouldn't. And you'd see one or two, but they were working for multinationals or some extension of the embassy like USAID or something like that. They weren't. But now that I am hired out to go and talk about the so on and so forth that's going on in Colombia, and it's so wonderful to see. And what you would see, for example, my stepmother, who's been down multiple times to Colombia, when she first started coming, people would say, aren't you afraid? Back in whenever it was. And now it's like, wow, you're going to Colombia. And I think her travel agent asked her about Colombia because she's getting more and more, what would you call it, inquiries about the place. So, and Colombians just love it when you come here. They love the visitors. And most of them have some sort of connection, let's say, to the US as well. Maybe there's some family, or of course, they're connected to US culture through television or music and so on. So there's always some common ground as well. And that makes things more accessible too.
I've noticed that with just about everybody I meet and have any sort of conversation with. It's, where are you from? I was very honored the other day, actually, or flattered the other day. I was standing in the park and this guy came up to, he was hungry and he, wanted to start a conversation with him. I gave him some few coins, but it was interesting because he started the conversation and then he said, "Are you from Spain?" This is in Spanish. He thought I was from Spain because my Spanish wasn't very good. I'm not knocking the Spanish, but I can tell you I've had a hard time communicating with people from Spain. So he thought I was from Spain. And when I told him the US, his eyes lit up and he said, "Wow, your Spanish is great." So I felt pretty good. That's the first time someone thought that I was from another Spanish speaking country, probably since I've started my travels. But anyway, the point of that is, just about everybody I have the conversation with, it's, we quickly get to, where are you from? And then they tell me they've got a cousin or brother, sometimes a parent or a child, oftentimes a child. The taxi drivers will have a child that lives in Miami or Chicago, or sometimes you ask them where, where do they live? And they're like, I don't know.
I don't know. It's up there somewhere.
But it's in the US. And there's a sense of pride is what I pick up on it, is there's a sense of pride. I have a family member in the US. It's either pride or it's a connection, with me, because somehow they're able to connect it, like you said. So that's interesting. And
it just made me think, sorry, you brought up Florida. So we're off to Florida for a week. I'm taking my kids to Disney World. It's a big, my wife this morning talking to my two children. And of course, they're bilingual. The 4-year-old, bilingual, 9-year-old, obviously very bilingual. But it's so funny. My wife goes, "You know what they speak up there? And you know what the language is in Florida?" She goes, "It's English. You're both going to have to talk English." And I'm like, "Technically, but I reckon you could probably speak Spanish everywhere."
I think they would be just fine, and probably find arepas and bandeja paisa in Miami as well.
They don't need that.
They don't need it. I bet they could find it.
Well, they eat it. They don't need it. There's enough options out there. But it was so funny. I was like, I reckon they could slip into Spanish everywhere.
Yeah. It's, and it's like, even, most recently before I started traveling full time, I was in Arizona. I had plenty of opportunities to practice Spanish and learn Spanish that I did not take advantage of. And I get a kick out of when I go back to visit my mom or my son. I like to take my son to the carnicerias, the Mexican butcher shops, and we go in there and I'm able to communicate with the people. And he just thinks it's so cool. He thinks, like, when he comes to Colombia and visits me, he's not impressed that I speak Spanish. But for some reason, when I'm in Arizona and we go into the carniceria, or I talk to a guy doing a project for my mom and I speak in Spanish, my son just thinks that's so cool. So
that's cool.
Anyway, so I'm working on getting him to learn as well. But Richard, I want to make sure that we have a chance to kind of pick up where we left off kind of on your story, because there's a lot of important stuff there. So you're in Guatemala working at the school, and you've literature, languages, and what happened next?
Well, I had to go back to England. To finish my degree, the fourth year. And I went back, and it wasn't a happy year, because I missed where I was. And I don't put it down to my colleagues, my companions in my same course and classes, but most of them, bar 3 of us. So one guy, again, close friend, two close friends went to Argentina, and I was in Guatemala. So there you go. Mm-hmm. And of course, that friendship became closer because we 3 had adventures, and the rest of them had all gone to the university organized locations in Spain, and they all lived together in Alicante and Valencia and wherever else. And they had a great time. And of course, but they didn't return speaking Spanish because their lives were with the other students and everything was laid out for them. There was no struggle. There was no real effort to be made. Whereas those of us who came out, and I was just a little bit unimpressed with it. But then anyway, I was decided by the time I finished my degree, I've got to leave England for a bit. But I got to make it worthwhile. So I got a flight back to Guatemala to see my friends. And at the meantime, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I'd always liked the idea of journalism. I obviously read a great deal and so on. And I got an internship at an English-speaking newspaper, English-language newspaper in Costa Rica. So I just sort of ambled my way down Central America from Guatemala to Costa Rica, and I was stuck around for about 6 months at this. I don't think the newspaper exists anymore. It was called Central America Weekly, and it was in several languages. It was owned by a German immigrants to Costa Rica stuff. And after a few months there, I liked it, but I thought Costa Rica didn't measure up to Guatemala in terms of its culture and in terms of what I wanted from a country. So I bought a flight to Rio. And I went to Brazil, and then I backpacked round South America for almost a year and a half, doing odd jobs here and there to make some meat, before deciding, well, I could sort of exist in that fashion, but at the same time, it's probably not the best idea.
Tell me about the language, your experience in Brazil, because I have not been back to Brazil since I've learned Spanish. I mean, I know it's kind of close, but did you full on need to learn Portuguese as well? Had you already learned some, or what was that like?
I knew some beforehand, but I was able to switch into it. One of again, not to blow my own trumpet, I'm not very good at science like chemistry, biology, physics, and things like that, engineering. I am good at languages. And so that's my thing. And I started reading, and you look at the language and you start to see similarities and pick up the vocabulary. And although a lot of people speak Spanish, if you speak fluent Spanish down in Brazil, they're not going to understand you fully either. So I was throwing Spanish phrases with Portuguese vocabulary, and that was fine. And then it slipped into Portuguese, and it really did, because I was there for quite some time, and it slipped into Portuguese. But by the time I'd finished up in the region, I'd applied to get on a master's course in London, and I got on for international journalism because I had the experience and I did enjoy it. And I got onto that, and it was an international one, which was great because everyone bar two of us were from the UK. Two of us were from the UK, and everyone else were working journalists from elsewhere in the world. And so that was really cool. A year of that, got through that.
Now, but you physically had to be there in class in London? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but it was fun. I mean, it was fun because, again, I was alongside journalists from Peru, journalists from Malawi, journalists from Yemen. As someone, I now think he works in the regime in China as like the communications office. But we're all in touch, and that was fun for the way it was. Although that the US and Israeli students sat on one side of the lecture hall, and anyone from the Arabic world sat on the other side of the lecture hall. And they really, when it was international lecture, boy, the fights that went on.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
But I learned a lot. I mean, those of us sort of in the middle, kind of like, my God, we're trying to talk about something else today, not just the issues in this. But yeah, it was great fun for that. And then out of that, you see, I did get jobs in London. I did get jobs. I worked for several outlets, media outlets, and was kind of unfulfilled. I realized that had I stuck around, and toughed it out, I would have got into the fields that I, wanted to, sort of being on a foreign desk as the editor or a correspondent of international news. But I didn't want to be in London doing that. And that's when I decided to leave after a while. I was like, I want to be in Latin America, reporting from here for over there, which is great fun. But again, for the UK media, it's not our sphere. You get the big stories and some good investigative stories published there. So I had to sort of shift my focus to the US, which was great as well. I mean, if you're out here long enough, they know who you are and you have a reputation. And it's been 25 years in Latin America now, more or less. And so I kind of known.
Yeah.
But it's hard graft, it's hard graft, but why not?
So are you still doing what role does journalism play in your business, your world right now?
I still say it's my job. I still say, despite everything. I am the host of another podcast called the LatinNews podcast. I'm employed for a company out of London doing that. The LatinNews sort of newsletter and newspaper has been around since 1964. It's well known in the circle, so I host that bi-weekly, and it's, I have to really research because I'm talking to academics and experts. Only a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to the former US ambassador to Brazil, who's worked under 7 different presidential administrations as an advisor on Latin America. So I was like, I need to get my story straight and so on.
So
I need to do
what I hear you saying is you actually have to prepare for those episodes, unlike myself, who just shows up and counts on the person that I'm speaking to, has a great story, and
you
we can
say
just have
that we had
casual
a call
conversation
ahead of time. We had a call ahead of time. You prepare. Don't put yourself down. But yes, and then at the other side, like only the other week, or was it last week or the week before, whenever this goes out, but there was that huge seizure of cocaine in the Pacific heading out to Australia. And I was immediately called up by the BBC and DWTV to give comments on TV. And so I do think of myself first and foremost as a journalist, and then as like an analyst, because for various companies I do due diligence investigations and also analytical reports, monthly analytical reports about what's going on in Colombia or Peru or Venezuela and so on. So I do think of myself first and foremost that. And of course, Colombia Calling podcast is journalism. And that's been going for 11 plus years. And then after that, I put myself out there. So, well, okay, then I've got the tourism industry through the small hotels in Montbos. The journalism also tethers into that a bit. You become a brand, and we do well through that because the journalists know who I am, and then they know I've got this place. It sort of works together as cross marketing. There's a cross pollination of these things, and then built on that, the journalism, the hotels. 2 years ago, I opened up the small publishing house, and we've published 3 books, and people know. It's like Richard McColl, this big brand, the Colombia Calling and so on. And it works. It works. As I said, I've got 6 different fishing rods for them to come through.
I'm curious because I heard you say, well, first and foremost, I'm a journalist. And then you're also a hotelier and a publisher and a podcaster. And when I asked you to give me your title for marketing of this episode and to introduce you, you said, Colombia Jack of all trades. And I see some of the all trades part in there, but I'm curious, what's the passion? I think you're passionate probably about all of it, but I'm just curious, like why you didn't say I'm a publisher, podcaster, hotelier. It's I'm Colombia. You mentioned Colombia specifically, Jack of all trades. So what's behind that?
Well, I genuinely love thick and thin, peaks and troughs. I genuinely love this, and it never fails to surprise me. You could be jaded about some things, but at the same time, what I say to people and how I do it is, okay, politically, it's a mess. Where else isn't? Let's be honest with that. But it's like stand back up onto the balcony and look from a distance at where you are and why you're here and what's going on and the improvements taking place and the people. And I feel that it's part of my role is not to promote Colombia as much. It's by loving this country, by understanding it, writing about it, the good and the bad, I'm doing hopefully a service. Is like you can weigh them up. Things are happening, but then look at this. Look at for example, you're here. You could be anywhere, but you're in Colombia. That's the truth of it, and I love it. And even like yesterday, I was at Expo Artesanía, so the huge artesanías folkloric sort of exhibition, and well, it's huge stands of everything from all over the country. And it's like a geography lesson for the country, going over and seeing different indigenous tribes and their wares and different people from all over the country, from Medellin or wherever. And it's a geography country. And you just talk to the people and they're so proud of what they have. And then finally I got to the food section, that's my deal. And I was just talking to the lady selling the shredded pork empanadas. And I said, this is just man of the gods. And I posted a photo of them. And I've had about 10 different Colombians ask me where I got them. I'm like, you don't know where to get this. This is the best. And so I think it's an acknowledgement of how wonderful it is.
I think, yes, I get that. And I mean, there's moments when certain cultural differences or things, I can get caught up in my head. So like, I think the other day when we were on the call, or maybe it was someone else I was talking about, but like if you go to the shopping mall in Colombia, Colombians move a lot slower than the typical person from the US, or let's just say me. I won't even say typical, but they move slow and they are big family people. So they tend to walk through the shopping mall with their family shoulder to shoulder. So you've got the family of 8 that pretty much goes completely across the whole walkway in the shopping center, and they move slow. And if they want to have a conversation, they'll just stop where they are and have a conversation. And that, sometimes when I'm like, I'm just trying to get from point A to point B and, trying to get around them, or if you're on the street, you got to step out into the street to get around them on the sidewalk and then hope you don't get hit by one of the motorcycles. And it can get frustrating. But so I get to remind myself, okay, these things that are frustrating for me are also what I love about it. I love the fact that they're so family oriented. I love the fact that they take their time and that they converse and they talk about things. And if their kid wants to stop in the middle of the sidewalk and play with something, they just all stop with them and keep talking while the kid does his thing, as opposed to get up off your butt, let's go, we were in a hurry, whatever. So it's finding it's like two sides of the same exact thing. So I can either focus on what's frustrating me, or I can just say, wow, I really love this, and the food, like, I don't know what your take. Colombia, I think, doesn't have a great reputation for food. And I'm not going to say that all of it's good. I'm not saying every time I go out and eat, it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing arepa or whatever. But there's moments, what I like about the food is the human connection around the food. That's the part that so if it's buying the shredded pork empanadas from the lady at the fair or whatever, I don't know if those empanadas, you're like, probably taste great, but you're also, I don't know, me anyway, I'm connecting with the person that's preparing it and I'm having a conversation, or maybe I'm connecting with other people that are standing in line waiting to get it. And it becomes much more of an experience. So like if I had those same empanadas delivered to my house, I'm not sure they would taste as good, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, this is it. I was talking to the ladies. There were the 2 ladies at the stand, and I went and had one, and I came back later and ate further 3 empanadas. And when I was there, a whole other family came up and they were like, I'm just watching you enjoy these empanadas, that we have to have them. And then we started talking. And then I was telling them that I went to there was a festival of lechona, or the shredded pork, in South Bogota. South Bogota is not a place where tourists go, and so on. And I was like,
I've stayed there. I know.
Yeah, we went down to South Bogota and went and tried lechona in various places, because that's where they had it. And there was one place called the Peppa Pig, a pork restaurant. And I was telling the ladies, and they were like, "You went down there and ate?" I couldn't not eat a Peppa Pig.
Peppa Pig.
But I wanted to and they just loved it. They loved it that I obviously immersed myself in something that was going on and was local. And I can tell you that I was the tallest person by some distance and the only foreigner down there during that feria. But when you talked about A to B, and this is something that used to affect me a lot, but I now take it on a different level, whereas I go, well, I want to go from here to the shop to get my lunch, and then to get home to eat my lunch or whatever. It's a busy day, but it's A to C, because B is all that experience with the 8 family people talking and walking shoulder to shoulder. And if you go out, for example, I live in like a business area of Bogota, lunchtime, what we call them, the oficinistas, who just amble back to the office. And as I was like, and I know at a stage where I just embrace it. Like, look at them zigzagging. If they walked any slower, they'd fall over. I love it. And so you just sort of embrace these things. And I'm amazed at how fast, when I go to the US, how fast people walk. And they're, the hurry. Just factor in more time. Just factor in. I know that to get to my kids' school on a good day, if I have to go, like tomorrow, for example, I have to go out there, it's going to take 20 to 25 minutes. but I'm going to allow an hour just in case. And that's how I think about these things. I'm not going to try and fit too many things into the day. And it's made my life a great deal more acceptable and calm, and I'm less stressed.
I suspect I have as well. I kind of wish I could go back a few years before I started spending so much time and just kind of see the differences. But yeah, in the morning, I haven't woken up to an alarm clock in quite a while. I mean, that's a new thing. And that doesn't mean I sleep in. It just like, I'm fortunate. I've got a window. I wake up to parrots, the loros outside the room, or sometimes the guacamayas, and sun comes up and I get up, I get ready, and I walk down to the panaderia and have some coffee and my croissant. And that's like huge. That's that's the way I start my mornings. I did not do that a few years ago. And I love just sitting there, drinking the coffee and watching people go by. You never know what you're going to see here. Whether it's the motorcycle with, the full family, and, you've got the wife on the back, the little kid in between, and then she's got a big screen television, that she's holding, or guys with washing machines on, stacked up on their motorcycles. Or I remember it wasn't too long ago, I was in Manizales, and it was like 11 o'clock at night on a Friday night. And I was walking back to my room, and this guy walked by me carrying a porcelain toilet on his shoulder down the street. I don't know if he was delivering it, if he stole it. I have no idea what the story was, but it's just like, I see things in Colombia. I'm like, where else would you see that? It's just the stuff that you see. I guess it's the land of magical realism, right?
I guess. I knew you were going to bring up the motorcycle. I just knew it. It was a thing. It's like this morning, there was a guy basically transporting a whole carpet down the street while I was waiting for the school bus, the motorcycle. And when you're up in like a more rural area, it's like you got the mum on the back, 2 or 3 children in the middle, the dog's on there somewhere, and maybe there's a couple of chickens strung over each side.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a sort of, what would you say? It's a democratization of transport and getting A to B to C with everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, magical realism is thrown around a lot, but it is that.
You just never know what you're going to see. And when they do on the first night, or on December 1st, which we're recording this in December of 2024. And on, I guess it's the 30th of November to the 1st of December, that night at midnight, they do the big firework thing where they do here.
Alborada or something?
Alborada, see. And I was here one year when they did it, but I was staying at a hostel kind of in the valley, and I noticed there are a lot of fireworks. It was pretty cool. But this last time I had a friend that suggested we go up to this viewpoint, and we went up there and we paid 10 mil to go up on top of this building that was under construction. So it had no rail on it. We went up to the very top floor. There was no rail. And so 10 mil is like $2.50 for both of us to go up to the top of this building with this amazing overlook of the valley. If anybody's ever seen photos of Medellin at night, it's incredible. And then the fireworks were everywhere. The whole city was exploding. It's like nothing I'd ever seen anywhere. I mean, we have fireworks displays back home on the 4th of July, but it's usually a fireworks display. And you might have some locals shooting off their small bottle rockets and all that stuff. But here it's like it just feels like every neighborhood must have access to a full-on fireworks display. Yeah. And you can just see it all. And I just, at midnight, I was just sitting there with tears rolling down my cheeks. And I was like, this is amazing. I've been to 30 plus countries, done some cool stuff, some really cool stuff. And this was one of the coolest things that I'd ever seen. And there were other locals around us, and it was just this big thing. And it was a pain in the ass to get there because the buses were full and the cars and the traffic. It took us 2 hours to get to this building. It took us another hour and a half to get back into town. But oh my gosh, it was so cool. And the Colombians are just like, yeah, this is how we live. To that, it's like, okay.
It's more of a Medellin thing, Alba. I don't know what the history behind it is, but what I love is that everybody's involved, everybody's there looking out for one another. But if you look at it from a US or European perspective, you're like, health and safety.
Yeah, because you notice I mentioned that this building was under construction, didn't have any sort of edge to it whatsoever. And I'm pretty sure that all the Colombians who are on top of that roof with me didn't even notice.
Hell no. Hell no. And they're probably swigging back aguardiente as well, you know?
Yeah, I mean, like, this is another thing that came up for me shortly after I got here, because when I came, even my family was like, Colombia. And I got here and I quickly figured out that the most dangerous things that I could see anyway were the motorcyclists that totally ignore there's a lot of one-ways in Medellin, and they just go wherever they want to go. So do not, if you're crossing a one-way street, you better look both ways. But then also the holes in the sidewalk, because they had the metal lids over the water mains or whatever. And apparently those have some value, so they tend to disappear. So there's a lot of holes in the sidewalk. So I was thinking my biggest chance of getting hurt here in Colombia is falling into one of those holes, or, stepping out in front of a motorcycle. So
yeah, I'm very aware of motorcycles on the pavement and in the bike lanes and going the wrong way.
Yeah, on the sidewalk. You said on the pavement, probably on the sidewalks. Like when there's traffic, they just come right up on the sidewalk. Yeah, it's
and the manhole covers, like you said, there was a study done and they were traced, the ones that were stolen out of Bogota. They ended up covering the manholes in Neiva, so a city like 5 hours south of Bogota had bought the stolen ones. And they said, like, Acueducto de Bogota, the water mains from Bogota, they were in Neiva. So they're trying to make a reinforced plastic one here, I think, that can't be stolen. But I'm pretty sure you can steal anything.
And they do some funny things around this topic, because the ones that haven't been stolen, they'll create these elaborate systems to lock them down sometimes. And you might see like locked down with not quite a padlock, but like bolted down, but the bolts stick up out of the ground. So
it's great to go over.
So you trip over those.
Yeah.
Or when they take the lid, sometimes people will like just put a rock in there, like that's supposed to keep you from falling into it. Or they'll put sticks and stuff sticking out, and you're like, it's just a funny place. And the locals I noticed early on, like, they're able to walk down the street and step right over these holes without even looking at them. They're on their phone. They're having their conversations. Nobody even seems to notice them. They manage to just time their walking so they can step right over them, where I gotta like constantly be paying attention. Anyway,
run down the street on their phone.
Yeah,
talking in women in high heels. Yeah.
It's so anyway. It's a pleasure. Richard, we've discussed. Let's real quick. I want to make sure that anybody that's listening to this has a good idea of what Colombia Calling podcast is, because I think that anybody listening to this would enjoy your show as well. So give us the elevator pitch on that, and just whatever they need to know about your podcast.
Thank you very much. Well, we're on all platforms, of course. Colombia Calling. It's been around since 2013. We've aired almost 550 episodes now. My sidekick, my co-host, Emily, is in fact Emily Hart, journalist. She's based in Medellin, and she does the news and on occasion interviews as well. So there's two of us working on it. She's been on for years now, and otherwise it was a solo gig with myself. But the idea is that the podcast is used, or Colombia is a lens for conversations. And we've had conversations with people in Nepal. We've had conversations with people. I've had Zambia, who has connections to Colombia. Everything is in English. We're just trying to give a broader understanding of what is Colombia. We do talk about the politics. We do talk about society. We do talk about the problems. Still, our favorite, the episodes that have been most downloads have always been about politics and what's going on. But we'll talk about NGOs working in trying to sort of, let's say, allay the plague of dengue, mosquitoes. We'll talk about boats down rivers and so on. Everything is covered, and we're out every week. And it's around 40 minutes long with the news in there. And it's just, I like the idea that people could sit down. They could either feel that they're listening to it as they're cooking or on their commute, or drinking a coffee with us as they are listening, or drinking a pint of the black stuff, a Guinness. If we're laughing away, it's as if we're sitting in a pub and having a conversation. My favorite people to interview, honestly, are academics who have their really niche information, and they are so happy to share it. Like the lady, the doctor of, I can't remember what she's a doctor of, but her name, Dr. Lina Pinto, who's just had a book out, who has able to explain, for example, that the disease leishmaniasis, a jungle disease that erodes your skin, but it's spread in Colombia because of the armed conflict. because of soldiers and guerrillas going through areas and moving to other areas. They ended up taking this as a vector. They were the vectors of this disease. And I just think things like that, or talking to a volcanologist, talking about how many volcanoes there are. I mean, we look out the window and we see a dozen or so, but even the tiniest bump in Colombia is a volcano. But that's what I love about it. We always have something very interesting, and people who are enamored with the country. My biggest market is the US, and I do get a lot of people in the Colombian diaspora in the US who listen, in particular, second generation, who may not speak so much Spanish, second and third generation, and they want to hear about the land of their parents or grandparents. So
it's very cool. I get the sense, Richard, that like when you're trying to find guests or come up with topics, I can see the look on your face. Other people are listening to this. I can't see the look on your face, but I can see the wheels going and the excitement. I suspect you just have conversations that you want to have, right? And you figure that if you're enjoying the conversation, if someone wants to listen, great. They'll probably enjoy it as well. But regardless, you're still going to have the conversation. And that's what I do with this show. It's like, I hope somebody's listening. I know somebody's listening, but I wanted to have these conversations regardless of the listenership, and the listenership just continues to go up, and I'm just going to continue to do that. And I suspect you kind of do it the same way, don't you?
Yeah, very much so. And again, there's a lot of feeding into other things. These people then become people who are acquaintances or a bit more, and I can call on them for interviews for other articles. And then people will hear about Montboz, where I have my businesses, and they want to know more about that. And it all goes together. I have listeners in Canada who are coming to Colombia, for example, this December, and we're going to go and have lunch. And I've been taken out for lunch by other listeners. Well, I'll always make some time. You're coming through Bogota, let's have a coffee. I'll always make some time. And it's really great.
It is, isn't it?
I don't know, 10 or 15 coffees this year with listeners come down to Colombia and stuff. And that for me it's really nice. And they might not watch it on YouTube. They might just only listen. It's putting a face to the voice. And hopefully I'm the same person as they think I am.
Well, it's been great getting to know you. I'm curious, is there anything I forgot to ask, should have asked, or that you want to make sure our listeners know about you or Colombia or anything before we wrap it up?
Hey, you want to support a publishing house? Just go onto Amazon and look up the first book we published. Both books are works of nonfiction. They're on Amazon. Look up Better Than Cocaine. It's Learning to Grow Coffee and Live in Colombia by Barry Max Wills, who's a long-term immigrant to Colombia with his partner. And he used to write copyright for movies and so on. And so he's a skilled writer. And it's a fantastic book. We've got 27 reviews on Amazon now, all positive. And then there's my book about the history and politics and society of Colombia called Colombia at a Crossroads, which has done well as well up there. So if you want background on that, both are available as ebooks and print-on-demand books. So if you're at a loss for what to buy for Christmas for someone, well, I know, don't know if this is going out, or a new year, buy those books. Support us, because we've got 3 books in the making for next year.
Let me ask you this. We're going to have a transcript of this conversation, so people should be able to find that. But are these, because I'm going to have your website link directly in the show notes as well. So if someone goes to your website, would they be able to find this stuff? Or
Yes, colombiacalling.co.
Yep. So we'll have that link right there. So very cool. Well, I suspect you and I are going to be collaborating on some projects, communicating, doing some stuff at some point here, in addition to what we just did. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to share a little bit about Colombia, but most importantly, kind of your story, your journey. And I trust that these conversations inspire people. I actually got a message this morning from a guy through my website, said, I've been binging on your podcasts. I've been wanting to travel more. My wife is not so much into it. So can you help me figure out, because I want to do this and I'd like to change things in my life. Let's just put it that way. And that's the hope of this whole show. Is maybe I even said it in a pilot somewhere, like, this show's get up off your butt and go do something, right? And make the world feel a little bit smaller. So thanks for helping us do that, Richard. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Jason, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
I trust you enjoyed listening to the conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you're enjoying the Big World Made Small podcast, Please take a moment to tell the algorithm by subscribing and posting a review so that others can benefit as well. I also invite you to take a quick trip over to bigworldmadesmall.com and join our private adventure travel community to receive new episode notifications, special access to our guest experts, and perhaps even some exclusive partner offers that we haven't discussed on the podcast. I'll publish another episode soon. Until then, keep exploring. It's the best way to make a big world feel just a bit smaller.